Alexander Reed had always been a respected name in the business world. At 38, he was one of the most influential real estate moguls in New York. Owner of a fortune that many could only dream of, he ran one of the most successful companies in the city. However, despite his empire and sharp business acumen, his personal life was a barren wasteland. Alexander's social circle consisted of executives, investors, and people who always wanted something from him. He rarely trusted anyone, knowing that most of those around him only cared about his bank account, not about who he really was. But there was one exception: Max, his golden retriever. Max was his only loyal companion, the only one who greeted him with genuine enthusiasm after long days filled with meetings, contracts, and exhausting negotiations. Alexander loved that dog more than anything in the world. However, due to his busy schedule, he needed someone to walk Max every day. That's how Lily Evans entered his life. Lily was 25, a hardworking young woman. She had grown up in a humble family in Brooklyn and dreamed of earning a degree in journalism. However, to pay for her studies and help her sick mother, she took on multiple side jobs, one of them being a dog walker. Walking wealthy people's dogs around New York wasn't exactly her dream job, but it was honest work and paid well. Besides, she had always loved animals, so in a way it was a job that brought her joy. Lily met Alexander through an ad. His secretary had hired her services, and from the first day, she was charmed by Max. The dog also seemed to immediately take a liking to her, and so Lily began working for Alexander daily. Although he was always polite and professional, Lily noticed a certain coldness about him. He never asked much about her life and always seemed distant, as if trapped in a glass bubble. But over time, their brief interactions started to change. Lily wasn't like the people who usually surrounded Alexander. She didn't try to impress him, didn't care about his money, and never hesitated to speak her mind. She was simply herself. And Alexander started to notice that. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings, Alexander arrived home exhausted. Max ran to greet him as always, and Lily was already there, finishing the dog's walk. He was especially excited today, she commented, smiling as she petted Max. Alexander let out a tired sigh and loosened his tie. Lucky him. My day was chaos. Lily noticed his expression and chuckled lightly. Well, maybe you should learn from Max. He finds joy in the simplest things, like a walk in the park. Alexander stared at her for a moment, surprised by her honesty. Most people he knew would never dare speak to him that way. And that's when, without thinking much, he did something he never imagined he would. Lily, do you have plans for tonight? She frowned, surprised by the question. Nothing special. Why? Alexander hesitated for a moment. The truth was that he had an extremely important business dinner that night. Key investors in his company would be there, and he needed to make a good impression. Normally, he would bring a hired escort to such events. Someone trained to act with elegance, smile at the right moments, and say only what was necessary. But at that moment, Alexander didn't want one of those artificial women by his side. He wanted someone real. I have a business dinner and need company. Would you like to come with me? Lily's eyes widened. Me? To a business dinner? Alexander shrugged. Yes. She blinked, confused. You do know I'm just Max's dog walker, right? He smirked slightly. I know. But I trust you more than I trust many people I've known for years. Lily remained silent for a moment. This was definitely the most unexpected thing that had ever happened to her. Okay, I guess I can go, she replied, still trying to process the situation. Alexander nodded, satisfied. Great. I'll be expecting you at 8 p.m. Lily just smiled, not knowing that this night would change her life forever. Lily still couldn't believe what had happened. She was in her small Brooklyn apartment, staring at the simple yet elegant dress she had borrowed from her friend Rachel. Never in her life had she imagined that a millionaire like Alexander Reed would invite her to such an important business dinner. This is crazy, she muttered to herself, looking at her reflection in the mirror. She had never attended a formal event like this. All her jobs had been casual, walking dogs, serving coffee in diners, or delivering food through apps. And now, suddenly, She was about to sit next to one of New York's most powerful businessmen. Rachel, who was sitting on the bed watching Lily get ready, laughed at her friend's hesitation. "You look like someone about to step into a boxing ring." "Relax." Lily rolled her eyes. "Easy for you to say. Have you ever been to a business dinner?" "No, but I've watched plenty of movies about them." "Just smile, nod, and try not to spill anything on yourself." Lily laughed but still felt her heart racing. What on earth was Alexander thinking when he invited her? At 7:50 p.m., Lily arrived at the address Alexander had sent her, an upscale building in the Upper East Side. A driver was waiting for her at the entrance and led her up to the penthouse. When the elevator doors opened, she found Alexander waiting. He looked impeccable in a well-tailored black suit, and his gaze quickly scanned her. "You look incredible," he said, without exaggeration but with sincerity. Lily felt her face heat up. "Thanks. I just hope no one notices this dress isn't mine." Alexander smiled slightly. "Trust me, no one will." She glanced around, impressed by the panoramic view of the city. "I never imagined I'd be here." He studied her for a moment before replying. "I never imagined inviting my dog Walker to an event like this." They both laughed, and for the first time that night, Lily felt like maybe, just maybe, she could relax. The dinner was held at the Sterling Club, one of the most exclusive restaurants in New York. The private dining hall was decorated with crystal chandeliers, impeccably dressed waiters, and an atmosphere of pure sophistication. As they entered, all eyes turned to Alexander, and, more importantly, to Lily. She immediately felt the weight of their stares. It was as if everyone was trying to figure out who she was and why she was there. Alexander noticed and leaned in to whisper, "Take a deep breath. They can smell fear." She let out a nervous laugh and tried to appear more confident. They walked to the table, where a group of elegantly dressed men and women were already seated. The eldest among them, a man with gray hair and a firm posture, smiled upon seeing Alexander. "Reed, always punctual." Alexander shook the man's hand. "Good evening, Mr. Donovan. I hope you're having a pleasant night." The man nodded and then looked at Lily, expecting an introduction. Alexander kept his tone neutral but firm. "This is Lily Evans." The guests exchanged glances, clearly expecting him to say more. Perhaps that she was a talented lawyer, an executive, or someone influential. But Alexander didn't add anything. Lily noticed the uncomfortable silence and, without hesitation, extended her hand to Mr. Donovan. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Donovan." The man hesitated for a split second before shaking her hand. "The pleasure is mine, Miss Evans." They sat down and the dinner began. Lily noticed that throughout the evening, some guests cast discreet glances at her. She wasn't naive. She knew they were trying to figure out who she was and what she was doing there. A blonde, elegant woman seated to Alexander's left finally broke the silence. "So, Lily, what field are you in?" Lily detected the slightly condescending tone in the woman's voice. She wasn't sure how to respond. She could lie and say she worked in some important industry, but that made no sense. So, she simply smiled and answered honestly, "I'm a dog walker." Silence fell over the table. A few eyebrows raised. A man cleared his throat. The blonde blinked several times, surprised. "Dog walker?" "Yes," Lily continued, still smiling. "I take care of dogs while their owners work. In fact, Max, Alexander's golden retriever, is one of my favorite clients." The woman opened her mouth to say something but closed it again. Clearly, she had been expecting a different answer. Alexander, on the other hand, observed the scene with a discreet but interested expression. Then Mr. Donovan chuckled. "Well, this is new. Reed, you always did have a way of surprising us." Alexander simply shrugged, neither confirming nor denying anything. Lily noticed that some people continued looking at her with subtle disdain throughout the dinner, while others seemed genuinely curious. But she refused to be intimidated. If Alexander had invited her, then she had just as much right to be there as anyone else. The dinner continued, but the atmosphere remained tense. Lily realized that despite the refined food and impeccable service, The real game wasn't in the gourmet dishes or expensive wine glasses. It was in the subtleties of the conversation. The table was filled with influential businesspeople, all used to playing a silent game of power and influence. Every forced smile, every seemingly innocent comment, every exchanged glance carried a hidden meaning. Lily might not belong to that world, but she was sharp enough to read the tension in the air. Alexander, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease. He had always been a master of this type of environment. He knew when to speak, when to listen, and most importantly, when to stay silent. But something about him felt different that night. Lily noticed that despite his impeccable posture, he didn't seem as interested in the conversations as usual. From time to time, he glanced at her, observing her reactions. It was as if he was trying to see this world through her eyes. "So, Lily, tell me," one of the guests started, a man in a navy blue suit with a sharp smile. "How did you and Alexander meet?" Lily knew exactly what he was implying. His tone was casual, but behind the question was something deeper, curiosity mixed with veiled disdain. She could answer in many ways, but she decided to be direct. "I'm Max's dog walker, Alexander's golden retriever. That's how we met." A brief silence settled over the table. Someone cleared their throat. The elegant blonde from before, who already seemed bothered by Lily's presence, raised an eyebrow. "How interesting," she said, swirling her wine glass. "Usually, guests at these events are, how should I put it, more involved in the business world." Lily caught the subtle venom in her words but simply smiled. "Yes, I imagine they are. But I suppose having an outsider's perspective can be refreshing sometimes. Don't you think?" The man in the navy suit chuckled lightly. "You have a good sense of humor, Lily. That's unusual." Alexander finally spoke up. "Lily has a unique perspective, and that's why I found it interesting to bring her tonight. Not everyone in real estate truly understands what happens beyond the numbers." His tone was courteous but firm, as if making it clear that he wouldn't tolerate disguised insults. Lily noticed that his words made some people uncomfortable. Perhaps because, for the first time, Alexander was standing up for someone who wasn't part of their circle. As the dinner progressed, Lily continued to listen attentively to the conversations. She might not understand everything about business, but she had always been good at reading people. Then, in the middle of one of Mr. Donovan's speeches about investments, something caught her attention. "The luxury housing market is on our radar. We've already acquired dozens of buildings in the area, and the revitalization plans should start next quarter." Lily frowned. "Which buildings?" she asked without thinking. The table turned to her. The blonde seemed to hold back from rolling her eyes. "Excuse me?" Donovan asked. Lily remained calm. "I was just curious. Which buildings have you acquired?" Donovan smirked slightly, as if amused that she was even asking. "Well, many. But one of the most recent was an apartment block in Brooklyn. The area needs significant revitalization." Lily's heart stopped for a second. "Brooklyn? Which area exactly?" "Oh, a housing complex near Atlantic Avenue. Something called Evans." A chill ran down Lily's spine. "Evans Court." "Yes, that's the one." Lily put down her utensils. Evans Court was where her mother lived. The building where Lily had grown up, where many low-income families still lived. "You're planning to renovate the building?" Her voice came out more serious than she intended. Donovan took a sip of wine before answering. "Actually, we're considering demolishing it to build something more modern." Lily felt a knot in her stomach. "And what about the residents?" He shrugged. "There will be compensation, of course. But business is business." Alexander was watching the scene in silence, and Lily realized that he didn't seem surprised. Her chest tightened. "You knew about this?" she asked Alexander directly. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes." Felt like a punch to the stomach. Lily knew Alexander was a businessman, but she never imagined he would be part of something like this. Her own building was on the demolition list, and he had known all along. The elegant blonde smirked slightly, sensing the tension. "Looks like we have a conflict of interest here." Lily didn't respond. She simply picked up her napkin, wiped her lips, and stood up. "Thank you for the dinner, but I think it's time for me to leave." Alexander stood as well. "Lily, wait." "Good night, Alexander." She cut him off, walking away without looking back. He stood there, feeling a strange weight in his chest. For the first time in a long time, Alexander wondered if he was truly the kind of man he wanted to be. The cold night wind hit Lily's face as she rushed out of the restaurant, her heart pounding and her mind racing. How could Alexander have kept something like this from her? She wanted to believe there was an explanation, but disappointment took over. As she tried to hail a taxi, she heard hurried footsteps behind her. "Lily, wait." She closed her eyes for a second before turning around. Alexander stood there, tense, clearly unsettled by how things had unfolded. "Is there nothing you want to explain?" she asked, crossing her arms. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, taking a deep breath. "I knew your mother lived there. I knew it was your neighborhood. But I didn't make this decision alone, Lily. It's business." She let out a humorless laugh. "Oh, right. Business. The magic word that justifies everything, right? The fact that entire families will lose their homes doesn't matter, as long as the numbers add up." Alexander felt the weight of her words. No one had ever confronted him like this before. "It's not that simple," he insisted. "For you, it's not. But for me, it is. We're talking about my mother, my neighbors, the people who watched me grow up. For you, it's just another investment. For me, it's the lives of many people being destroyed." Alexander fell silent. For the first time, he realized how his decisions affected real people. Not just numbers on a contract, lives. "I'm going to fight against this," Lily declared. "If you don't care about these people, I do." She turned to get into the taxi that had just stopped. But before closing the door, she said, "And to think I actually believed you were different." The door slammed shut, and the taxi drove away, leaving Alexander standing there, feeling an emptiness in his chest that he couldn't quite explain. That night, Alexander returned home more shaken than he wanted to admit. He tried to convince himself that Lily just didn't understand how the business world worked. But deep down, he knew she was right. The next morning, he couldn't focus at work. His assistants noticed his distant behavior, and even Max, his golden retriever, seemed to sense that something was wrong. After hours of overthinking, he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He went to Brooklyn, to Lily's neighborhood. When he arrived, he saw a group of residents gathered at the entrance of Evans Court. Lily was among them, talking to an older man who looked worried. She spotted Alexander approaching and crossed her arms. "What are you doing here? Did you come to convince me to accept the demolition with a big check?" Alexander ignored the sarcasm and looked around. The building wasn't luxurious, but it had something his Manhattan skyscrapers never would: history, community, real connections. "I want to understand," he said seriously. "I want to see it with my own eyes." Lily raised an eyebrow, surprised. "And why now?" He took a deep breath. "Because you made me see something I never saw before." Lily hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Fine. But don't expect me to treat you like a guest of honor." Alexander didn't expect that. Over the next few minutes, Lily introduced him to several families who had lived there for decades. He spoke with an elderly woman raising her grandchildren alone, a young couple who had just had a baby, and a war veteran who considered the building his only home. For the first time, he didn't see just bricks and contracts. He saw stories, lives that would be affected by his decisions. And, for the first time, he felt guilt. Lily noticed Alexander absorbing everything. He didn't say much, but he observed carefully. When they finished the visit, he looked at Lily and said, "I need to think." Lily simply nodded. "You better think fast. Because we're going to fight to save this place. With or without you." Alexander knew this wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Alexander left Brooklyn feeling a weight he had never experienced before. He had spent his life making decisions based on numbers, statistics, and market projections. That's how business worked. But now, for the first time, he saw faces behind the contracts. That night, he sat in his penthouse office for hours, staring at the city skyline. From up there, everything seemed small, distant. But he knew that just a few blocks away, There was a building full of stories, about to be erased from the map by his own company. Max, lying beside him, lifted his head and looked at him as if sensing his restlessness. Alexander stroked the dog's fur and sighed. He knew he had to make a decision, but whatever choice he made, there would be consequences. The next morning, Alexander arrived at the office earlier than usual. His assistant, Ryan, noticed his unusually serious expression. During the meeting with the investors, the topic of Evans Court's demolition came up. Everyone seemed excited about the project's progress. As soon as we remove the last remaining residents, the machines can start working. It'll be a major transformation for the area, one of the directors said, satisfied. Alexander listened in silence. He looked at the documents in front of him, projected profits, benefits of the new development, numbers that, until recently, were all that mattered to him. But now, all he could see were the faces of the people he had met the night before. He took a deep breath, closed the folder, and looked around the room. The demolition project is suspended. Silence filled the room instantly. What? Donovan asked, surprised. I've heard enough to understand that this decision will hurt a lot of people. We're not going through with it. Alexander, this isn't a personal choice. We're talking about an already signed contract and involved investors. Do you realize the financial impact of this decision? I do. And I also know we can find another solution. Donovan chuckled, incredulous. You've always been a businessman, Reed. I don't understand why you're hesitating now. Alexander took a deep breath. Because, for the first time, I'm seeing beyond the numbers. The room's atmosphere grew tense. Some looked at him with disapproval, others with shock. Alexander knew this decision wouldn't be easily accepted. But he also knew he couldn't ignore everything he had seen and go back to being the man he was before. When the meeting ended, he picked up his phone and dialed Lily's number. She answered after a few seconds, her voice cautious. What is it now, Alexander? Are you calling to tell me you've already started tearing down my neighborhood? I canceled the demolition. The silence on the other end lasted long enough for him to think the call had dropped. Then, Lily let out a deep breath, her voice filled with disbelief. Are you serious? I am. She didn't answer right away. It seemed like she was absorbing the information. When she finally spoke, her voice was no longer as hostile as the night before. This doesn't change everything overnight. But, thank you. I wanted you to hear it from me first. And what's the next step? I'll try to negotiate another solution with the investors. But regardless, your building won't be demolished. Lily didn't know what to say. Part of her still didn't fully trust him. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore the fact that Alexander had actually changed something important. I hope you keep your word, she finally said. So do I. The call ended, but for the first time in years, Alexander felt like he had made the right decision. He knew there would be consequences, but for the first time he didn't care. Alexander's decision did not take long to cause a stir. The following day, emails and calls flooded in. The investors were furious. The demolition of Evans Court was a key piece in the company's expansion plans, and canceling the project meant a considerable financial loss. Donovan was the first to schedule an urgent meeting with him. When he entered Alexander's office, his cold and calculating expression made it clear that this wouldn't be a friendly conversation. I hope you have a very convincing explanation for this impulsive decision, Donovan said, crossing his arms. Alexander leaned back in his chair, keeping his composure. I made the right decision. There are entire families living in that building. We can find another area to revitalize without displacing people. Donovan let out a short, incredulous laugh. You've always known that the real estate market isn't a fairy tale, Reed. People lose their homes every day. That's just part of the game. Maybe I don't want to play this game anymore. A tense silence filled the room. Donovan intertwined his fingers and leaned slightly forward. You have shareholders to answer to. They won't accept this decision without consequences. I know, but I won't back down. Donovan studied him for a moment before sighing heavily and standing up. Very well, Reed. But don't forget. Good intentions don't pay the bills. As soon as he left the office, Alexander felt the weight on his shoulders grow heavier. He knew this wasn't over. That evening, while reviewing some reports, he received an unexpected message from Lily. "Lily, do you have any plans right now?" He smiled slightly before replying. "Alexander, none that I can't cancel." "Lily, good. Meet me in Brooklyn." For a moment he hesitated. He wasn't used to accepting invitations that weren't meticulously planned. But with Lily, he felt something different. Something that made him want to step out of his perfect and predictable routine. When he arrived in Brooklyn, Lily was waiting outside a small corner diner. She wore jeans and a simple blouse, completely different from the sophisticated women who usually accompanied him at events. Yet somehow she looked more real than any of them. "I thought you might need a burger after your day as an unlikely hero," she said, smiling. Alexander chuckled. "I don't know if hero is the right word. Well, you stopped dozens of people from losing their homes. Sounds pretty heroic to me." They went inside, where Lily ordered 2 burgers and fries. Alexander felt completely out of his usual environment, yet surprisingly comfortable. As they ate, Lily watched him curiously. "You've always followed the rules, haven't you? Always did everything the way people expected you to?" Alexander nodded. "Ever since I can remember. My father always said emotions were a luxury that businessmen couldn't afford." Lily frowned. "That sounds suffocating." It was. But it worked. At least until now. She tilted her head, analyzing him. "And now?" Alexander was silent for a moment before replying. "Now, I don't know anymore." Lily smiled slightly. "Maybe that's a good thing." For the first time in a long time, Alexander started to believe she might be right. Alexander had never felt so disconnected from the world he had built for himself. His decision to cancel the demolition of Evans Court not only created backlash within the company, but also awakened internal doubts he had never allowed himself to have. For the first time, he was questioning whether all of it, the real estate empire, the numbers, the cold negotiations, was truly worth it. In the days that followed, the investors started making their move. Rumors spread that some board members were considering replacing him as CEO. Donovan was behind the plan, and Alexander knew his leadership was being threatened. Amid all this, Lily continued fighting to ensure Evans Court was legally protected. She still didn't fully trust Alexander, but the fact that he had taken a stand against his own interests made her see him differently. One evening, she invited him back to Brooklyn. He hesitated before accepting, but deep inside, he longed for that real connection. When he arrived at Lily's building, he noticed that she was organizing a community meeting. Residents sat in improvised chairs in the lobby, discussing strategies to pressure the city to prevent future eviction attempts. He stood at the doorway, observing from a distance. Lily spoke with passion and conviction, and it was impossible not to notice how much people admired her. She didn't have money, status, or influence, but her strength came from her authenticity. When Lily saw him, she made a small gesture for him to come closer. "I'm surprised you came," she admitted after the meeting ended. "I think I'm trying to learn a few new things." She smiled. "Well, then let me teach you the art of drinking terrible community coffee." She led him to a table where an old coffee pot was still steaming. The smell was strong, and when Alexander took a sip, he had to work hard not to make a face. "This is offensive." Lily laughed. "Welcome to the real world." For a moment, Alexander just looked at her. He had met many women in his life, some more beautiful, others more sophisticated, but none as genuine as Lily. She didn't try to impress him, didn't play games, and that was something he had never realized he needed. "Do you believe in me now?" he asked unexpectedly. Lily looked at him for a moment before replying. "I think I'm starting to," and for the first time, Alexander realized he wanted to be the kind of man Lily could truly admire. The following days were a real test for Alexander. Pressure within the company increased by the hour, and the investors were growing impatient. He knew his decision about Evans Court had set a dangerous precedent. If he started prioritizing people over profit, his credibility in the market would be at risk. But for the first time in his life, he didn't care. That afternoon, when he entered his office, he found Donovan already sitting there, flipping through some papers as if he owned the place. "You know, Reed, I'm impressed," Donovan said without looking up. "I never imagined such a promising CEO could throw his career away so quickly." Alexander closed the door, keeping his cool. "Let's get straight to the point. The board wants you out of the company. They're already organizing a vote." Alexander had expected this, but hearing it out loud still hit him hard. "Why?" "Because I decided not to kick dozens of families out of their homes." Donovan chuckled. "Because you showed weakness. Business isn't a game of emotions, Reed. If we start prioritizing sentimentality, we lose money. And when we lose money, we lose investors." Alexander felt anger rising inside him but maintained his firm stance. "So what happens now? You have two options. First, resign quietly, keep your reputation intact, go enjoy your fortune, and pretend you never cared about this mess in Brooklyn. And the second?" Donovan smirked. "Fight us and lose everything." A tense silence filled the air. Alexander looked out the window at New York's skyline. For years, he had built this empire. But now, looking at everything he had achieved, the only thing that truly seemed to matter was what he was about to lose. He turned back to Donovan and replied with confidence. "Call the vote." Donovan laughed in disbelief. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." Alexander simply smiled. "Maybe I'm finally getting something right." The boardroom was silent. Alexander sat at the head of the long mahogany table, surrounded by familiar faces that, at that moment, felt like strangers. The board members had gathered for the vote that would decide his future in the company. Some had neutral expressions, while others were visibly displeased. Donovan, seated to his right, appeared relaxed, as if he already knew how this would end. "We are here today to discuss the leadership of Reed Enterprises," Donovan began, his voice formal. "As you all know, there have been recent disagreements about the company's direction and decisions made by our CEO." Alexander remained composed, but inside, he felt a mix of frustration and anticipation. He knew this vote was already set against him. "Let's get straight to the point," Donovan continued. "All those in favor of removing Alexander Reed as CEO, please raise your hand." One by one, hands went up. First 3, then 5. Within seconds, the majority had voted against him. Alexander let out a slow breath. It was over. "It seems the decision has been made," Donovan said, satisfied. "Alexander, we appreciate your service to the company, but as of today, your position as CEO is officially terminated." The silence in the room was suffocating. Alexander stood up slowly, adjusted his suit, and cast a cold gaze around the room. "I hope you all sleep well knowing you sacrificed integrity for profit." Without another word, he left the room without looking back. Out in the hallway, he stopped for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him. He had lost everything. His company, his position, everything he had spent years building. But strangely, he felt no regret. For the first time, he felt like he had done the right thing. Hours later, Alexander drove aimlessly through the city. He didn't know exactly where he was going until he realized he was already on his way to Brooklyn. When he parked outside Lily's building, she was already sitting on the front steps, as if she had been waiting for him. "You lost," she said simply. "I lost," he admitted. She studied his face for a moment, then smiled. "Well, welcome to the real world." Alexander chuckled, shaking his head. "I have nothing left, Lily." She turned to face him fully and, with quiet conviction, said, "You have a fresh start." For the first time in his life, Alexander had never considered things from that perspective. Lily reached out and took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. And for the first time in years, Alexander felt something money had never given him: peace. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real victory. The following days were chaotic. Alexander's name was in all the headlines. Alexander Reed removed as CEO of Reed Enterprises. Millionaire loses everything after controversial decision. Alexander Reed, hero or fool? But instead of fear, he felt relief. For the first time in years, he wasn't a slave to expectations of a board, investors, or a public image. For the first time, he had time to figure out what he really wanted. In the months that followed, he completely distanced himself from the corporate world. He spent more time in Brooklyn, getting to know the city in a way he never had before. And Lily? She continued fighting for her neighborhood. With Alexander's help, she secured legal support to ensure Evans Court wouldn't be torn down. Slowly, the residents started to believe they could truly win this battle. One evening, sitting on the steps of her building, Alexander turned to Lily and said, "I want to start something new, something of my own." She smiled, intrigued. "What exactly?" He looked at the horizon, thoughtful. "Something that actually makes a difference." Lily remained quiet for a moment before taking his hand. "I think you've already started." Alexander smiled, realizing that, for the first time in his life, he was genuinely happy.